Three things I'd like to do with you this morning. There you go. Thanks, Joe. One is I'd like to talk about, I think there's a problem. It's a problem, some of it will be slightly repeated from some of the things I did last time I was here. But I think it's particularly a problem for us men and about how we deal with the Lord's Day, the Sabbath. The second thing I'd like to do is talk to you about what I think are three key habits. When we go to Sunday, these are the three habits we need to have in our mind if we're to, in a sense, kind of live out the Lord's Day in the way it's supposed to be. And then three, which is much to do with that handout. And by the way, the handout, my wife has been very helpful in terms of helping me think through this. And much of what's in the handout actually comes from her in terms of practice. What does it look like in the concrete? And so eventually get to that point. So first, the problem. You and I are made for the Sabbath. We're made for the Lord's Day. There's a really wonderful line they often say that if you ever know any Jewish people, there's something very powerful about the Jewish people keeping the Sabbath. But actually what somebody have said, no, that's not what happens. It's actually the Sabbath that keeps the Jews. And it's actually the same thing for Catholics. I've met Protestants who have always been somewhat impressed by Catholics in terms of our Sunday obligation. But in many respects, what often keeps the church is the Lord's Day. Vatican II talks about the Lord's Day being the source and summit, the Eucharist being the source and summit of the church. And yet, we find ourselves in particular kinds of ways of violating the Sabbath, of violating the Lord's Day. And there's lots of different ways, but I'd like to talk about two particular ways, two symptoms of it, of what we might call careerism and consumerism. But it actually comes from a deeper reality. And this reality is called acedia. Acedia. That would be the Latin terms. And it's very interesting. It's one of the 7 capital sins. And Thomas Aquinas talks about this, and particularly a man named Joseph Pieper, say that acedia is a sin against the Sabbath, against the soul's resting in God. And by the way, they put this along with pride, greed, sloth, right? All these things. Acedia is actually considered, the translation is sloth. But here's the problem. It's not simply physical laziness. It's actually a spiritual laziness. And that spiritual laziness has different manifestations. So the first one I'd like to highlight is careerism, the overworked phenomenon. And instead of going into the abstract, let me go into a personal story that gets to it. I came to St. Thomas, the University of St. Thomas, in 1991. And I was a new professor. I had a new job, new marriage, children, no money, lots of debt. By the way, the big financial problem I had was I married a woman with the same amount of debt that I had, right? This was not a good financial decision. It was a decision great in every other way, but not in that way. And as we were also starting this program called Catholic Studies, I was doing a lot of traveling. Joe mentioned the international dimension, and I was doing a lot of international traveling. And in order to get everything I needed to get done, this is before the electronic calendar, 7 days a week, 5 in the morning, 10 at night, half-hour segments, I had it all scheduled, including Sunday, by the way. All right, a couple hours of work done, maybe before the kids would get up and things of that sort. And that was really what I thought I needed to do in order to get the things I needed to get done. Well, after about 10 years of this, the cracks started to show. The marriage strains. Because of being so busy, you kind of skim over the problems. Men are really good at that, right? We just kind of skim it over. We think we fixed it, and we kind of keep going, but it hasn't been fixed, and it seeps down into a kind of resentment that can occur. By the way, before having children, I thought I was a patient guy, right? And of course that happens. You're not, and your children bring those things out to you. And then one of the things that actually kind of occurred was how Sunday was experienced. And this has a long, actually, psychological tradition to it. It's called Sunday neurosis, right? Why is it that often on Sundays, particularly in the afternoons, a certain degree of boredom, a certain degree of angst, it's kind of a low-grade depression starts to seep in? And so all these things were starting to kind of seep in. And then it hit. In 1999, I was giving a talk out in San Francisco, and I got a massive anxiety attack. it came out of nowhere. And right before the talk, I'm saying to myself, I can't talk. And breath was kind of being thrown out of me. And I said, this is silly. I can do this. I can do this. No, I can't do this. No, I can't do this. And I was just about to turn to the guy saying, I can't do this. I have to leave. And the guy started introducing me. And I walked up, and I was dumbfounded that this will just kind of took out of me. I could not will it. And yet I did will, one word after the other. My voice started to quiver. And it was one of the most humiliating, humbling experiences I had in terms of my professional career. And I thought, I don't know if I can continue to do this anymore. And through a whole variety of different things and a lot of different issues, I was able to kind of move through that. But it was a kind of powerful experience. And it was a kind of what they would often call the deep valley. And one of the things that was kind of coming to me at that time was why? Why is this happening? And there's lots of reasons. Lack of sleep was one of them. Too much coffee was another, right? But one of them was, there's a very famous Catholic theologian, his name is von Balthasar, one of the great theologians of the 20th century. And he says, one of the biggest problems of modernity, of a hallmark of the modern life, is our inability to receive. Our inability to receive. And that's what Sunday is about. It's not about me to go and do more work. It's in many respects, it's me to receive the Lord's work on me. And in many respects, as business people, as professionals, as activities, as men, we are mission-oriented. We are actors. We want to get things done. David Brooks has this line called Adam 1. We're Adam the creator. But we have had a hard time having this power of the soul to receive. And that, in many respects, is what the Sabbath is about. Now, by the way, as careerists, as people who are in this, in terms of mighty work people, that's been one of our challenges. Do we have the capacity to receive? Not on our terms, right? But on the Lord's terms. So that's partly problem number one. Problem number two is an acedia is what we might call the escapism problem. So that if we are able to receive, sometimes we receive poorly. And thus, we look at terms of entertainment. And we want to be entertained. And thus, our Sundays or our non-work time is often a kind of escapism. And thus, the entertainment becomes the problem. And of course, as we're sitting here in football season, you know, and by the way, let me be very clear. There's nothing wrong with a good football game, right? But maybe 6 hours of football on a Sunday may be a little bit too much. Now we're even able to do 9 hours of football, if you look at Sunday night football, right? And so the question is, what about the entertainment? And I mentioned this before last time I was here. Billy Joel, I think, still catches it, right? He says, you know, they know it's been me they've been coming to see to forget about life for a while, right? Often our form of entertainment, what we receive, is escapism. It's interesting, that word amusement, right? It's a muse, a muse. Muses are the goddesses of the liberal arts. Those are things that ought to refresh us. You put the word ought in front of it, and it negates it. And thus, amusement is staring stupidly at something. This is always my wife's description of me watching television, right? This is often the problem. And so we run into this. And again, I mentioned this last time I was here, but I think it's helpful to return to it. Often the way we look at the weekend is the challenge. And often our advertisements are pretty key on this. And thus one advertisement talks about the weekend getaway, right? Our body checks in, but our mind checks out. And this challenge of the weekend becomes a serious problem because it affects how we look at our celebrations. And thus, if a weekend is about escaping, it's my time to escape because I've worked so hard, thus what happens is the way we look at celebrations often reflect the weekend. And thus it forms the commercialization of Christmas, the other decadence of St. Patrick and Mardi Gras, the ghoulishness of Halloween. All of these days which were meant to be holy days, holidays, have turned into kind of forms of escapism. So I think the question about how we look at the weekend and how we look at Sunday is a real challenge. And I'm going to draw in this talk a lot from John Paul II. He wrote a great apostolic letter called Deus Domine, the Lord's Day. And if you ever get a chance to read it, it's on the web, just read the first chapter. It's on the Lord's Day. All of us do the Lord's Day. If you read that first chapter, it's pretty powerful. And here's what he says one thing he says in the document. He says, when Sunday loses its fundamental meaning and becomes merely part of a weekend, it can happen that people stay locked within a horizon so limited that they can no longer see the heavens. Hence, though ready to celebrate, they are really incapable of doing so. Somebody once said, if you want to kill Christianity, abolish Sunday. But we can abolish Sunday in a lot of different ways, right? Our amusements will often shove it aside. Our work kind of gnaws at it, right? And all sorts of things can, in a sense, make it a smaller reality. And yet, this idea of Sunday is of so critical importance. Let me give you maybe one helpful way of thinking about it. And it might be a kind of audit. An audit that says, what fills our time on Sunday? And so obviously many of us, I think, being Catholic here, certainly find worship here. But there's a lot of ways in which we can fill our Sunday. And so the question is always, what is the amount, how much time do we spend in each of these particular areas? And just take a hard look at it. Am I spending way too much time in amusements? Am I spending enough time in family and things of that sort? And then ask ourselves, are we, in a sense, obeying that commandment of the Sabbath? By the way, the commandment of keep holy the Sabbath is one of the big 10. And yet sometimes we can be somewhat casual about it. I often think, what if I went to my wife, and I said, honey, I tried that commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. It didn't work this week, I'll try it next week. You don't mind that, do you? Right? You know what would happen to that marriage. And yet sometimes we're a little bit on the casual side when it comes to this question of the Sabbath. And so how can we take this thing a little bit more seriously? How can we take it in a sense of looking at it? And so this is the thesis I gave last time I was here. I'm not a very creative thinker, but I'll change it a little bit. But the thesis of this talk, right, is that if we don't get Sunday right, we won't get Monday right. And then there's a whole sort of other theses that go along with it, right? If we don't get rest right, we won't get work right. If we don't get receiving right, we will not get giving right. If we don't get the contemplative life, we won't get the active life right. If we don't get our culture right, we won't get the economy right. And if we don't get worship right, we won't get life right, right? Sunday is not merely a time for our own little private endeavors. There is something very public about a Sunday. Bishop Barron has this great line when he says that often false worship leads to a false social order. And if we had a lot more time, I would say that many of our social problems has a lot to do with this idea of keeping holy Sabbath or not keeping holy Sabbath. So what does that mean? What should we be thinking about? What does the Sabbath and the Lord's Day look like? Let me make a couple more points from John Paul II on the Lord's Day. A lot of us, when we think of the Lord's Day, we think of Sunday Mass. And it is of critical importance. But this is what John Paul says in this document. He says, sharing in the Eucharist is the heart of Sunday, but the duty to keep Sunday holy cannot be reduced to this. It's a temptation, I think. In fact, the Lord's Day is lived well if it is marked from beginning to end by grateful and active remembrance of God's saving power. So what does that begin to look like? And if I can hearken back to what I was talking about at the beginning, remember, at the heart of a Sunday, at the heart of the Lord's Day, the heart of the Sabbath, is this capacity to receive. Benedict XVI, in a great line when he says, the most profound thing in our lives is not what we've achieved. It's not our title. And by the way, there's great things about our achievements and there's great things about our title. But the most profound thing in our lives is what we've accepted, what we've received. And so what does that begin to look like? What are the habits of this receptivity that are necessary? And there are 3 habits. And they're very simple, but very important. The personal habit of the habit of rest, the second habit of celebration, and the third habit is of charity. Let me highlight these 3 habits. The first habit is of rest, of stillness. By the way, this picture is actually of a fresco in a church south of Rome called Monte Cassino, the great Benedictine monastery there. And it's one of 4 Benedictine virtues. And this is the virtue of obedience. Watch her hand. She's listening. The key thing is this idea of receiving, of obeying, right? What is the capacity for us to hear? And this is a challenge for all of us. I talked about this last time I was here, right? But a lot of us have within our heads all these tapes have been going on for years. My tape, by the way, I constantly get into debates with my colleagues at St. Thomas, and I'm constantly saying, how can I win all these? By the way, I always win the debates in my head, right? If life could be so good, right? I'm the unappreciated genius, you know, and you go on and on and on and on about what is the thing that's going on in the head. You got to stop the tape. What stops that tape? And this is what we mean by silence, the stillness. Joseph Pieper, he's also another person that I'll be drawing upon in this talk. I always draw upon what he does. And he wrote a great book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And in the book, he says this. He says, silence. He says, unless we regain the art of silence and insight, the ability for non-activity, unless we substitute true leisure for our hectic amusements, we will destroy our culture and ourselves. Rather pretty serious. And another great guy named Guardini, Romano Guardini, put it this way: we must earnestly desire stillness and be willing to give something for it. Then it will be ours. Once we have experienced it, we'll be astounded that we were able to live without it. Because here's what silence does. It magnifies things in the human heart. We often don't know what's in our place because we often don't take the time to listen to it. And that's what a silent attitude will often do. But silence, by the way, is not enough. We need another habit, and it's the habit of celebration. By the way, I would say silence is actually slightly a danger by itself. There's a lot of stuff going on right now, what I would call, people will say, I'm spiritual but not religious. And thus that means they don't have to go to church, they don't have to be connected to religion. And basically the other thing they're saying is they really don't care about it. Because if you really cared about the spiritual life, you'd want to be connected to other people. You would never just keep it to yourself. Now, by the way, they often say it's an ugly sight to see somebody who's religious but not spiritual. That is true. And that is a problem we have to deal with in our church. But the idea that you can just simply do this on your own is naive. And eventually it dies. And that will often what happen. So the idea of celebration is of critical importance. And again, John Paul puts it this way. He says, for Christians, Sunday is the fundamental feast day established not only to mark the succession of time, but to reveal time's deeper meaning. That's what celebration is about. We go there, and what do we find? It tells us where we have come. It tells us about our origins. Where do I come from? It tells me about my destiny. Where am I going? And it tells me about who I am this day at this particular moment. This is what celebration does. It celebrates. Because here's the thing. What a celebration will always do, it is a radical affirmation that this world is good, despite all the crazy junk that goes on in this world. This is why we begin a wedding, not with the reception, right, but with the Eucharist. Because it says that this marriage, this love is good, despite all the divorces, despite all the violence, despite all these things, this is good. That's what a celebration does. Not because I say it, not because I think it, but because it is. And that celebration also gives us deep identity. Think about it. When you and I go to Mass every Sunday, it's just not you and I going to Mass here in Sioux Falls. Not even in the United States. People from all over the world are walking to Mass. It is the most beautiful thing about our church in terms of its global identity. And all of us coming to the same Mass, participating in the same reality. That's what a celebration does. It gives you deep identity. You can't get that sitting in your own place, doing your own particular thing. You can only do that through the church. So that's the idea of celebration and importance. But the third habit is the habit of fraternal charity. And again, nobody better than John Paul II in Deus Dominus says this. And here's what he says. He says, the Eucharist is an event and a program of true brotherhood. From the Sunday Mass, there flows a tide of charity destined to spread into the whole of life of the faithful, beginning to inspire the very way in which they live the rest of Sunday. And then he says this. He says, the faithful look around to find people who may need their help. It may be that in their neighborhood or among those that there are sick people, elderly people, children or immigrants who precisely on Sundays feel more keenly their isolation and their needs and their suffering. So Sunday should always be an idea of extending ourselves out. So silence, celebration, and this idea of fraternal charity. So what does this begin to look like in the concrete? And by the way, the handout that I have will kind of highlight some of these things. By the way, let me be very, very clear, and the bishop would certainly know this. Everyone sitting in this room is at different places, right? Most of my kids are out the door. Joe Runton has his kids in there. His Sunday and my Sunday are probably going to look a little different, particularly at the beginning of that day, right? Right? So we want to be mindful. So all we're going to do is whenever you get into the practices, realizing that these practices can have different kind of expressions. So I'm not trying to say that this is the only one practice. But here's what I would say are a couple of things that one needs to be mindful. If you don't prepare for the Lord's Day, it will get away from you. My wife, by the way, on Wednesday, she has in her calendar, takes 10 minutes, think about Sunday. And then a couple of things comes around. It's not a long time of preparation, but she thinks about the meal, she thinks about what we should do, she thinks about a couple of things, and it just gives her kind of a frame of mind, this is what we're going to be doing. Because if you wake up on Sunday and you say, okay, well, so what are we going to do? You know what's going to happen. It just kind of turns into a mush. Second thing, technology fast. This is not easy. And here I would say, and I say it over and over again, and I keep saying it to myself because I keep violating it, we need to disconnect. And we need to disconnect from our technology. We can't do it all day. Many of you have a lot of important things. A lot of things happen often on Sunday with your work. You can't get totally disconnected to it. But technology is probably the thing that I'm finding to be most difficult in this world. And it's the thing that actually gets us into bad habits. And so one has to find some way in terms of connecting or disconnecting from that. Thirdly, Sabbath prayer. Actually, in your packet on page 2, my wife adapted this prayer, and we say it every Sunday. When we get up together, we get up at different times, but when we eventually get up, but I'd like to take you to the second paragraph of that prayer. And we read this prayer together. We go basically one paragraph to the next. But the second paragraph I really like. It says this, let this Sabbath day, this Lord's day, bring blessings of joy and peace to our hearts as workday thoughts and cares are put aside. Let the brightness of the Lord's day light shine forth to tell that the human divine spirit of love abides within our home. In its light may all our blessings be enriched, all our griefs and trials softened. Right? You say this prayer every Sunday. It's going to have an impact. It starts to have an impact on your day, right? And you can write it, you can do it yourself, you can take somebody else's, but it's the idea of reminding, what day are we moving into? Because the Lord's Day is to be a different kind of day than the other 6 days. When the Lord created, he worked 6 days and he rested on the seventh. The seventh day is a different kind of day. One could look into the course of morning prayer and extended prayer. One could look, and this has been great for my wife and I, we take a walk. And we actually we would never have done this at the beginning, but we've been walking a lot, so we do about a 4-mile walk. Right? Now we can do that because the kids are gone and things of that sort. And we talk, and after a while we talk, we say the rosary, right? And all sorts of things just start coming up from that walk. I would say that walk has been really critical to our lives. And of course, Mass is going to be critical, and it's the highlight of it. And by the way, I put a few things in the handout about the Mass and the importance of the Mass. And also the importance of the feast, of the brunch, and the idea of having games together, right? And also trying to find ways in which to volunteer. By the way, the volunteer I find to be the most tricky, because I've tried to do it and I've done it so badly. So for example, one time we started this Catholic worker house in the Twin Cities, and I was finding myself that I'm going off on Sundays doing the work over there, and the kids were too young to take, so I was leaving my wife with the kids while I'm going off volunteering. This is not the way to do volunteering, right? You got to understand the particular situation in which you're in. So all of these things have to be kind of tried. They have to be experimented with. They have to be kind of expressed in different ways. And some will fail and some will succeed. And you got to be patient with yourself and be, in a sense, somewhat compassionate, but nonetheless diligent that you're moving into it. So what does that mean for us as men? And here, if you don't know this wonderful scene, it's from Caravaggio. It's a wonderful painting in Rome, right outside, right in the heart of Rome. And it's about being called, right? And you and I are called. And thus, we are to be receiving a call. And so at the heart of it is to be receivers. And part of our Sundays is the reason why it's so important for us to have that receptive attitude that God is calling us. And Sunday is the day to listen to that. So that's an important part of it. But it is also in the sense that we are to be called to be protectors. And we are to protect the Lord's Day. It's very interesting, particularly as men, right? If you look through the Old Testament, the importance of what men, actually the very word in Hebrew for man or male it comes from the root to remember the patrimony, that which has been given to us, right? And we are critical to the continuation of the faith within our families. Studies have shown this all over the place. When men abandon the faith, when the men start to get convenient about it, when men start to make compromises, things fall apart. The reason why we are the patrimony is that we know we need our wives to do this. That is critical. But without the men, wives can't do it on their own. And thus we have to be protectors. So what are we the protectors of? We are protectors of the day, right? We are protectors of this day. And that is a very important part. Put a red line around your calendar on Sundays and protect the day. By the way, I got to tell you, I've not always done that well. Last year, my wife said to me in September, she says, "Do you know that you have missed 9 Sundays this year?" Oh, you're counting. Uh-oh, right? Right? Because of travel and things of that sort. And actually, it caused me to say, uh-oh, I thought I had this right. I didn't have it right. And she's calling me on it, right? Because work creeps in. And since then, by the way, I got January and February is looking pretty ugly for me right now. But this year, I've only missed 1 because of travel. And I actually had to say no a couple of times, and the sky didn't fall through, right? The question is, what do we protect? Protect the day. Protect your marriage. I don't think I'm speaking out of line. I don't think I'm exaggerating. The Lord's Day saved my marriage because my marriage was going in a very incremental, subtle, gradual way in a place that was not a good place. And one of the things, every marriage here is different. But the idea of resentment, particularly in a woman, is something that every man should be very careful about. Because it takes a long time for that resentment to show itself. And if we skim over problems and we say, oh gosh, I've talked about that, do I need to talk about that again? Yes, you do. Because she needs to talk about it. They need to talk usually a lot more than we need to talk, as you know. And the Sabbath is a wonderful day to, in a sense, bear those things out, to wrestle with them, to deal with them. And it's not always pleasant. Sometimes we've worked so hard, we want to just rest and take it easy. But actually, part of Sabbath is also allowing for that relationship to deepen. And the Sabbath is that day for that to happen. The idea of children and protecting our children is also critical. Helping our children to dress. I have not always done that very well, but I had a colleague, in a sense, he really takes interest, particularly in his boys, about how they dress for Sunday, right? To protect our children is of critical importance. And again, like I said before, we often talk about nuns, kids who are leaving the church, Much of it has to do with the witness of the Father. Not all of it, but certainly a lot of it. Protect the worship and protect the fun. Have fun with your kids. Play games, play football, get out there, get into it, right? This is what Sunday should be about. And if we do it well, it will have great implications for the work that we do. And we see some interesting models. I know many of you probably know Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby. It'd be interesting to talk to some of the people within those organizations because they've done some pretty radical things. To think that a fast food restaurant, right, and a retail store can be closed on Sundays. I mean, if we think we have problems in terms of getting all the work done, think about what that will do for the bottom line for those two organizations. And yet, they're very profitable companies. They took a risk. And these are models that we need to be thinking. We have to be prudent. We can't be careless. There are some times when we're going to have to work on Sundays because things come about. But we need, in a sense, reclaim that day. So we have a few minutes, some time for Q&A. My question to you is this. How do you as men and husbands and fathers reclaim the Lord's Day for your family? And what are the challenges we're facing? And what creative ways can we live out this Lord's Day commandment? So thank you very much. So we have some times for questions, thoughts, and if there's anything you don't particularly like what I said, don't hesitate to let me know about that. You actually make me feel at home if you started to say, that was dumb. Right? So, Joe, how are we on time here? We got 8:30, right? To 8:30? All right. So, yes. Right behind you, and then we'll go right here.
Thank you so much. I needed that. One of the things that strikes me is that because it's one of the Big Ten, it's something I have to do.
Right.
But you kind of frame this in a way like I want to do this because of the outcome.
Yes.
How do I change it from something I have to do to something I desire to do? You just thought maybe if we talk a little bit.
Wow.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. It's absolutely, it's interesting. I had that kind of question in the talk, but Joe said, listen, these guys got to get out to work, so I had to start cutting some of the things down. But what we're raising is, here's one of the challenges of the Lord's Day, because so many of us often see it as a duty. It's a Sunday obligation, right? And thus, we come to it sometimes with duty in mind. And that duty is actually not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with duty. As men, we have duty. And sometimes it's actually the only thing that keeps us going is simply willing duty. But here's the problem. If you only have duty, and if you only focus on law, it grows cold. And once it grows cold, it eventually becomes very fragile. And once it becomes very fragile, it's very hard to pass it on. And this is one of the things we have to face as Catholics. We were so big on the idea of Sunday obligation. Do not miss your Sunday obligation. Do not miss Mass. And so, of course, we do all these things all day, and we squeeze in Mass at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock at night. And we lived our day no different, but we felt like we did our duty by getting to Mass. Now, in some days, that's okay. But as a way of living, it is not. Because eventually it falls apart. And that's what's happened today. Now we don't even have duty. Matter of fact, most people don't think of duty. A lot of people think, well, I'll go to Mass when I feel like it. And they don't even think twice about it, right? So the idea is exactly right. We need the Sabbath. When God created us, He created us to work and He created us to rest. It's in our DNA. And by the way, we don't break the law. The law breaks us. The problem is it takes a long time sometimes for that law to break us. It eventually shows itself up. It sometimes takes generations to show up, right? So duty is good, but it's not enough. Necessary, but insufficient. And thus, we have to come to the idea of the desire for it. And that's why we have to get into the habit of silence, starting your Sunday. If you don't have silence in your life, on Sunday, it's going to be hard to get it anywhere else. And so, can you create new habits? And the fact is, most of us are trying to overcome bad habits. And so, but I would say that's the idea of habits, because that's what, Joe and I were just talking about, the importance of virtue. The virtue are those good habits that become qualities within us. So then I wake up in the morning, I want silence, right? I want it. I can't live without it. This is the Guardini quote, right? And that's when you get to that point, you're moving into the right way. So great question. Thank you. Please.
Mine's probably not that great, but the obligation of Sunday worship. How does the church balance that with allowing Saturday to be a part of your obligation, your Sunday obligation, so that we can just knock it off on Saturday night, go about our business?
Right. And so that's the other part of the challenge, right? The church is actually always trying to be a loving mother to deal with the people that they have. Now, I would suspect, although the bishop might want to correct me on this because I don't know the details, but the Jews start often the Sabbath the night before. And I would think that one of the reasons why the Mass was often anticipatory was the idea that you begin the Lord's Day the day before, right? And so there was something about recognizing that we have masses to, sometimes it was out of necessity because they couldn't fit everybody into Mass on Sundays. And so I don't know if that was one reason, but it could have been what. But nonetheless, starting the day before. Now, by the way, I know some people, there's a community in the Twin Cities called Christ Redeemer. And they start the Sabbath, the Lord's Day, the night before with dinner. That has not worked in our family. Because it's always been too crazy. It just hasn't worked. So we started on Sunday, but some people started the day before. And you could start with Mass as that type of element. Now you're exactly right. The attitude. Sabbath is an attitude. It's an attitude. And it's not an attitude to say, okay, get this thing out of the way, knock it off, and then I can go off and do whatever I want. That's a bad attitude. That's not the attitude you want to convey to your children. That's not the attitude you want to convey to your folks, right? And so there can be some convenient factors that maybe something will come up. Sometimes I have to travel on Sunday, particularly international travel, because I have to do things on Monday at particular places. And so I might go to Mass on Saturday. I'm grateful for the church that has given me the opportunity that I could at least get the Mass, because that Sunday was a problem. But if I'm doing it for other reasons, right, it runs into the problems we just talked about. Does that? But I do think it's a great question, because things that are often offered were often offered for good reasons, but there have been unintended consequences, and then certain attitudes start to seep in that has caused us a whole set of problems. So, yes.
I find that comment about the attitude about the wives being more resentful, if you will. They take that on, and then on Sunday it explodes. So I'm questioning why that's not applicable to the males, the husbands.
The resentment question? I think it is. I guess I was largely talking about my experience. Here, I'm grateful for the question, right? Every couple deals with things in different ways, right? And so some couples, at least in my experience, maybe there is resentment kind of seeping into me. I don't even know it sometimes. But I have been finding out that, let me put it this way. In my parish, here's been a pattern that has really worried me. Couple, married, goes to church, have kids, and then one day, wife wakes up saying, sorry, I'm not in this relationship anymore, I'm leaving. Guy, radically surprised, saying, what's going on? How did that happen? I'll go to therapy, I'll do anything to do it. Wife says, no, had enough, and leaves. I can't tell you how many stories I've seen like that. And I say that because I think resentment has occurred. Because guys often don't get it. Sometimes we're a little thick. Now, some guys are really good. Some guys are good. I'm not, right? I'm thick. I often don't even know that there are signs that I often can't kind of read. And so I need space and time for that reading. Now, maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but when you said, does a resentment occur within men? Yeah, depending on the relationship, it could be reversed. And they could be kind of dealing with the question of resentment. Am I on track, or you're fine? Okay. So the resentment could be applied to men too. But if you look at a lot of literature often refers to often in terms of women. So I think Joe's given me the hook. So let me end. Let me end with a quote from John Paul II. Oh no, go back, Joe. There you go. That's great. Yep, get on that one and highlight. Nope. I just leave it there, Joe. That's fine. They can read my notes on it. So can you read? No. All right, I'll just go right through it, Joe. That's fine. I'll go through the whole presentation. All right. I want to read this last quote by John Paul II because I find it to be quite powerful. It's almost there. Sorry, guys. And there you go. And he says this. He says, "Do not be afraid to give your time to Christ." Most of us men, by the way, we're not fearful. But actually, there's often deep fears going underneath it. I was giving a talk to a Legatus group in Omaha. And I remember in this conversation, the Sabbath came up, the Lord's Day came up. And this one CEO kind of sheepishly raised his hand. He says, "I got to tell you, I like what you're saying, but I don't think I can do it." He says, "I get up, I go to Mass, we have brunch, and about 12 o'clock, I'm back to work." He ran his own business. And then somebody says, "Well, why don't you just try?" He says, "Well, I'm afraid about what's going to happen on Monday. I'm afraid what's going to happen in the competition. I'm afraid what's going to happen to the bottom line." And those are real fears, by the way. Let's be very honest. We are in a very competitive world. And what we don't want to do is do things that's going to cause serious economic damage to organizations. But the fear is something we got to deal with. Even the fear of, by the way, if you want to sound really cool to your kids, use the acronym FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. This is the new kind of acronym that often kids will do it. And even we have the fear of missing out on a football game, the fears are often driving us away from what can be actually happening. And thus John Paul continues this, and he says this. He says, "The rediscovery of this day, of Sunday, is a grace which we must implore, not only that we may live the demands of faith to the full, but also so that we may respond concretely to the deepest human yearnings. Time given to Christ is never time lost, but it is rather time gained, so that our relationships and indeed our whole life may become profoundly human." And it seems to me that what he's trying to get at is at the end of the day, as we move toward our end, there are only two kinds of people. There are those who are resentful and those who are grateful. Those who are resentful often think they should get more than what they've gotten because they often see the world in that way. But those who are grateful recognize that they've been given a great gift. And Sunday is that great gift. And if we can take that on and live that, we will live lives of gratitude in everything we do, including the businesses that we're running and working in. It is a great joy to be here with you guys. It is so impressive to see all you men here. And so thank you very much. God bless you all.